Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking fantasy goaltending, and I'll break down everything from strategy to targets to tools you can use to find what you're looking for when it comes to your specific league format and point weighting. Now, the number one rule on this channel is to not draft a goalie in the first 2 rounds or 24 picks depending on your league size. And I've explained this many times, but for those of you who are new here, let's quickly recap why you don't do that. So I covered all of this in more detail in my 22-23 season recap video on goaltending, and you can check that out in the description below. But just for a quick summary, this is sorted by position rank at the end of the season. So what you're seeing is the top number of goaltenders. We're just going to focus on the top 10 here. 8 of the top 10 final goalies were risers, meaning they were drafted and they exceeded their draft position by the end of the year. The 2 guys who were drafted in the first round, Shesterkin and Vasilevskiy, they were still good. They still became G9 and G10 by the end of the year, but they lost about 30 positions of value dependent on where they were drafted. So you drafted them in the first round to be a elite top 10 type of player in fantasy, and they didn't necessarily hold up all of that, all of their end of the bargain. They did regress relative to where they were drafted, though they did continue to play well, and you didn't really have to worry about goaltending if you own them. But this is sorted by positional rank at the end of the season. What if you sort it by ADP? So that's what we did here, and you can see a lot of these guys are disappointing. The only 2 who aren't are Sorokin and Oettinger, and that's a key thing to remember. These 2 guys were drafted relatively high, 31 and 44 in these drafts, which is pretty much in line with what we were talking about strategy-wise. They weren't first or second round picks, and they did hold up their value because they're elite goaltenders, as we see as we move forward in this video. But the rest of these guys did regress, some of them more than others. I would still say that Shesterkin, Vasilevskiy, and Saros are good goaltenders to own in fantasy. They just did regress about 25 to 35 spots relative to where they were drafted. Some of these guys had other circumstances that were in play. Anderson's constantly hurt. He's always dealing with injuries, so that was part of that narrative. Fleury lost the net to Gustafsson, who we saw on that top 10 list. Darcy Kemper was injured a little bit, but had to deal with about 40-plus games of John Carlson being injured as well. And Tristan Jarry battled injuries for the second half of the season and wasn't healthy for most of that time either. So a lot of these guys were dealing with injuries and other circumstances, and that happens, and you have to factor that in when you're drafting these guys. Now, the rest of this line represents right around the 70 mark, which is the tail end of the 5th round in a 12-team league, or the beginning of the 5th round in a 14-team league. That's where you want to start targeting goaltending in general. Hellebuck was an excellent goaltender. Swayman, Georgiev, Thompson, all of these guys, only one of these guys was disappointing in that range, and that's Carter Hart, and he only regressed 18 spots, and you drafted him at 162, so it's hard to classify that as disappointing. But let's do a little bit more of that. So the guys who were regressing, we labeled as disappointing, and the difference between a goaltender and a forward or a defenseman regressing is as follows. So the percentage of goalies drafted in the first 6 rounds were labeled disappointing was 70%. So you're looking at these guys all up in here. A lot of them were disappointing. The percentage of skaters drafted in the first 6 rounds who were disappointing is around 51%. So you have a higher chance of being disappointed if you draft a goalie in the first 6 rounds than if you draft skaters. So that's why we recommend pushing goaltending back a little bit. Now, what do you want to look for in terms of goaltending? Are we talking, do you want an elite starter? Do you want a tandem on a really good defensive team? Do you want to push goaltending all the way to the end and just take high-risk guys and hope to find something on the waiver wire? Well, there's a tool that you can use to help you find exactly what you're looking for depending on where you're drafting. Now, I would recommend, if you're drafting at the front end or the back end of the snake draft, that's one position where you would maybe want to draft a tandem and push goaltending back a little bit further, because you have the ability to draft 2 guys consecutively and you don't have to hope that your guy's going to be there. So if, let's say you're drafting in the middle, number 6 out of 12, you have to pick one guy and then hope that he doesn't get picked in the next 12 picks or whatever before you can pick up the other part of that tandem. That's a little bit risky. If you wanted to go that route, I would use the draft position that you're given as the barometer of what your goaltending strategy is going to be. So if you're picking at 6, maybe you want that G1 because it's going to be hard to get a tandem. If you are picking at the front or the back end of the snake, maybe you want that tandem, and if you have that option to get that tandem, you can push them back really far in your draft, as we will see in just a moment. But let's look at the tool that you can use to help you hone in on who classifies as an elite G1 as a regular starter who's got some risk built in, and potential tandem options. Okay, now what you're looking at is the 23-24 Goaltending Hub. This is something I've been working on for a while, and we finally got it to a place where you can now filter by exactly what you're looking for. You get the ADPs here, you get your rankings, which is an average of all of the categories that go into this, which is games played, wins, goals against, save percentage, goals saved above expected, and team expected goals against per game, which gives you a sense of, is this guy playing for an elite defensive team? Are they better than expected in terms of their skill level? How's their regular stats, their save percentage, goals against? Do they get a bunch of wins? Because a lot of people have point weighting where you get extra points for wins. And then how much do they start? Are they a number one? Are they a 1A, 1B? Are they a tandem? So let's start with what I went over in last year's video on finding elite G1s. You want a guy who plays 50 games. That's going to be a nice cutoff between a 1A, 1B situation and an actual starter. So you can just filter by games, and this will filter out all of the guys who don't get that level of starts. Now, this will give you a nice list of starters. Not all of these guys you want to own. John Gibson is unownable. You can look at some of his stats. 4.0 goals against, 899 save percentage. You don't want any of that. His goals saved above expected is -11. You don't want that. His team expected goals against is, I think, dead last in the league, 3.91. So you don't want access to that. Same thing with Binnington. Vejmelka's an interesting case because he is better than expected. He's very skilled. He just gets shelled because he's on a terrible defensive team. That might improve this year. You don't know, but I typically, I mentioned Ville Husso in a potential bounce back video. You can check that out on goaltending bounce backs. I never go Bobrovsky. If you've watched this channel for a while, you'll know why. He's very inconsistent. And if you look at his numbers from last year, he was a little bit above expected. His team isn't great defensively, but a below average save percentage, below average goals against, only one shutout. He did play 50 games, only won 24 of them, so less than a 50% win percentage, so really not the best option. Jacob Markstrom is a nice bounce back candidate. Carter Hart is kind of up in the air. I don't know what to make of him this year. I do think Darcy Kemper is going to have a nice bounce back. His team defense was related to John Carlson being out for so long. With John Carlson back in, I would think that they come up above 50%. He's above, goal saved above expected is positive, so that's a good sign in the right direction. 5 shutouts, 908, which is slightly above average save percentage, slightly above average goals against. The wins should come up with a better defense as well, and he's going at ADP 99, so that could be a nice value G1 if you're looking for it. But let's filter out and try to find the elite guys, the guys that if you want that elite number one, you want to target them a little bit earlier in the draft, but maybe not in the first 2 rounds. So the next thing I said on the video last year was you want a guy who's playing for a top 50% defensive team. So we'll filter this out. So we're getting the top half defensive teams in the league. Now this is going to get a little mixed up because we don't have a guy selected. So let's just look at one guy, Connor Hellebuck. He's as consistent as they come. 93 a couple years ago, 89, then down to an 80. But still, at an 80, he's probably in the top 10 in goaltending, fantasy goaltending in 21-22, and then he bounces up to an 86. So now he's within the top 3 in this list, and I believe in the top 5 or 7 in the overall list. But this is going to give you a sense of the guys that you can target. Now, the other thing that I said was you want a save percentage above 915. That's going to be elite level in fantasy more often than not. If you have save percentage as a category in your Cats league, you're going to want to have your eye on this stat as well. And when you filter out by the start volume, the team defense in front of them, and a 915 save percentage, the list dwindles to 5. And you're looking at Ottinger, Georgiev, Hellebuck, Sorokin, and Shesterkin. And of these guys, Hellebuck is giving you the best value at 31 ADP. So he's a guy you could target maybe in the 3rd round in most 12-team leagues. He used to go a lot further back. Guys were disrespecting him because of Winnipeg not being the most elite team to own somebody on, and they don't have the best defense. They're 58th percentile in team expected goals against per game, but he's extremely better than his expected goals against. He's got a 920 save percentage, 4 shutouts, 2.5 goals against, and he gets a ton of starts, 64 starts. So you're getting elite level start volume. In fact, he's started more games than any other goalie over the last 5 years, and he's about 70 games more than the next best guy, which is Vasilevskiy. So he's played a ton. Now that's good and bad. He might be wearing down a little bit. You never know as he gets older, but at the same time, you never have to worry about putting him in because he's going to get the starts. They do have Brossoit there. Again, he was a very good goaltender in Vegas, so there is some help there. Maybe they're going to limit his workload from 64 games down to 54. Still going to be a really good G1. So these are the elite G1 options. You can go on the Discord. The Patreon link in the description below. You can get access to this goaltending hub and play around with this and get exactly what you need. Now let's do the opposite. Let's clear out these filters and let's find tandem options, the guys that you would want to own if that was going to be your preference. If you're drafting towards the front or the back end of the snake, you probably want a tandem option who's going to get you a really good defensive team, and you're going to have access to both of their goalies. So we'll look at the filter the opposite way. So 50 games max. So now it's going to filter out guys who are playing a little bit too much, and it's going to give you a little bit better look at some of the tandems that you're going to want access to. Now I'm increasing this team expected goals against filter because it's going to give you a couple more options, but basically you want a top defensive team if you're going to stack both goaltenders together. So that's giving us Boston, which you have Ullmark and Swayman. They're going way too high right now. So Ullmark's at 25. That's way too high for him. 47 for Swayman is probably accurate considering how good of a goaltender he is. And we could just take a quick look. You're getting that elite defense. He's very good in terms of goals saved above expected. 4 shutouts in only 37 games. 24 wins in 37 games, but that's probably going to come down this year a little bit. 2.3 goals against, 920 save percentage is elite level. Next, you have the Minnesota tandem. Now, Fleury's not on this list, but Gustafsson is. He would, I would imagine, be the number 1 or the 1A in that situation. He's going at 63, which is a really nice spot to get him because look at his save percentage. 931, 210 goals against, 22 wins in 39 games is not bad. 3 shutouts, extremely well above expected. And his team's defense is actually really good. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Dumba, not in the lineup anymore, but I still think they have a pretty good defense. Spurgeon and all those other guys that you're used to seeing back there. They're going to get the job done, and Gustafsson can cover it up if they don't get the job done. He's very good skill-wise. So you're looking at Boston. Minnesota is a decent tandem option if you can get Fleury. Schmid is I don't know if he's number 2 or number 3 on the depth chart. Vanacek is going to go a little bit higher than this. In fact, let's bring some of these parameters down so we can get a couple more lists or names in this list. So Brossoit, as I mentioned, he's not getting an ADP right now. You could get him off the waiver wire. The Islanders tandem, if you go for Sorokin, you could pair that with Varlamov way later in the draft, 169. That could be a decent option. But the number 1 tandem option this year is Vegas. So you're looking at Logan Thompson at ADP 162, and you're looking at Adin Hill at 150. So if you have the front end or the back end of the snake, this is who I would be looking at to target. And I would probably move up in the draft to pick them at 130 or something just to be safe so you get them, because you don't want to push it all the way back to 150 and then have them get sniped out in front of you. So maybe around the 130 range, I would start to pick both of these guys up if you had that front end or the back end of the snake. And you can see Adin Hill has been trending in the right direction over the past couple of years. He comes over to Vegas, gets a nice jump, about 14 points from a 56 to a 70, and you're still getting that elite team exposure. He's right around expected in terms of goals saved above expected, which is why people kind of were disrespecting him a little bit in the playoffs, saying he didn't win them the Stanley Cup. But it's basically because of that, because he didn't, have to stand on his head. But he is still a really good goalie. 914 save percentage, 2.5 goals against. The win ratio is not bad, 16 wins in 27 games. Logan Thompson was the guy earlier in the year. Then he went down with injury. He was trending up over the last 3 years as well. Same team exposure, right around the same goals saved above expected. 2 shutouts, 21 wins in 37 games, 915, 270. So you're looking at almost identical goaltenders. And what happened was 2 years ago in Boston, they ran an exact split. So Ullmark got 41 games, Swayman got 41 games. Their stats looked almost identical to what you're looking at for Hill and Thompson. And then ultimately, one of them took the ball and ran with it. Ullmark became the Vezina Trophy winner, and the rest is history. But if you do that tandem with the Vegas goaltending this year, you open yourself up to that possibility of finding that Ullmark or finding that Swayman, and you're getting them so late in the draft that your elite offensive and defensive players that you're drafting in the top 6 to 8 rounds are going to be able to carry your team. So you're getting elite level goaltending on the back end. You do have to use 2 positions to get it, but then you're also adding a ton of offensive upside in the front part of your draft. So this could be a really nice strategy. There's another team on here that you're seeing that has a decent goaltender who's technically in a 1A, 1B, and we don't know what it's going to pan out this year, but that's Stuart Skinner. I don't like Jack Campbell, and I'll show you why in just a minute, but Skinner's been climbing over the last 3 years, 23, 59, and then a 78. You're going to want access to that win ratio, 92 percentile, 92nd percentile in wins last year because of the fact that he's playing for Edmonton. They're going to win a ton of games, even if they're not the best defensive team. They are a much better defensive team. They were top 10 once Ekholm came over after the trade deadline. So they've gotten better defensively. He's above expected in terms of goals saved above expected. Didn't get a ton of shutouts, but that could potentially increase with Ekholm back there now. 913 save percentage, 2.8 goals against. And when you compare that with Jack Campbell, the results are night and day. So I have to uncheck Stuart Skinner to get Campbell to pop up. This is kind of how this works. If you search somebody and you click on the name, then it's going to take one or the other. You got to clear the other one out. So it's a little bit finicky that way, but it's still a lot easier than just using one or the other. But you look at Jack Campbell, he's a 45. Compare that to Skinner at 78. Still getting the same team exposure, way below expected in terms of goals saved above expected. He did get one shutout. The save percentage is unownable. Goals against is not terrible, but it's not good either. The wins are fine. 21 wins in 36 games is all right. So if you're in a point league that only cares about wins, or you get extra point weighting for wins, maybe you want to go with the Skinner-Campbell tandem. I don't like Campbell. I'm not going to recommend him, but if you wanted just one of those two, I would go for Stuart Skinner. He's going at 97.5, right around the same range as Kemper. So that could be a really nice play for you if you're looking for that. Now, in terms of some of the other goaltenders that we're looking at, we can clear some of these filters and give you a little bit more to work with. The defense is a nice thing to have, but if you don't have that, you can find some other guys who have a really good save percentage. Maybe they don't get a ton of starts, maybe they don't have a good defensive team, but you can find some other options. So here's UC Saros. He should be much higher on this list, but his team defense is not the greatest. 14th percentile in team defense, but look at his goals saved above expected. So he's top 2, I believe. It was him and Ullmark in this range in goals saved above expected, but because of the team exposure, the shutouts are low. So 919 save percentage is excellent. 2.7 goals against is pretty good. The wins are really nice, 94th percentile, and he's starting 64 games. Now, he does have Lankinen as a backup, I believe, still, but he's the guy. He's the guy who's going to get all of the starts, so you're definitely going to want him as your G1. If you're targeting him, he's not going to be a tandem option. He's going to be the guy that you run with. He's going at 48.8. That's a great spot to get him in. He's a great value option if you can get him in that range. He might go a little bit earlier depending on your draft. There's a couple of other options on here that are interesting. Obviously, Vasilevskiy shows up here. The reason why he and Saros weren't in that initial elite options list is because of this team defense. 3.3 expected goals against per game is not great in terms of Tampa Bay. 40th percentile in that metric. So they're not the same defensive team that they were a couple years ago. I think McDonough has something to do with that. And McDonough is now on Nashville along with Luke Schenn, who's a great shot blocker. So I do like Saros a little bit more this year than in previous years. And because of that, you might not fade Vasilevskiy, but he's going at 19 now where he was going at around 8 or 9 last year. So it's now kind of being factored in. But he's still a great goaltender, 95th percentile in goals saved above expected, 4 shutouts, 915, 2.7, 34 wins. So you're getting that win coverage and about 60 starts over the course of the season. And they don't really have a good backup, so I couldn't imagine that number going down. A couple other guys we could look at here. Joonas Korpisalo, he played for LA last year. They were a really good defensive team, and his number would have been higher if he were still on that team. Comes over to Ottawa. They're not a terrible defensive team, but they're 34th percentile in expected goals against per game. He is better than expected in terms of his goals saved above expected here, 91st percentile. 914, 2.9 goals against is a little bit high, but the save percentage is good. The wins are going to be the question mark. How many games is Ottawa going to win this year? We don't know that until they get on the ice and play the games, because they just haven't had this level of goaltender and the consistency that they've needed. Anton Forsberg is a really good goaltender, but he's been hurt. I think he tore both of his MCLs or ACLs over the past year, so he hasn't been the most consistent option. Now they bring in Korpisalo, and hopefully that solidifies things for them. But this is just giving you a sense. You've got some higher risk options. You've got some guys in tandems, and you've got your elite G1s and your regular G1s. Now there's one other guy who isn't part of this list who I did want to mention. And it's a guy that I was recommending heavily last year, and boy, did that backfire on me. And if you listen to me, I apologize for recommending Thatcher Demko. But here's why I recommended him. The previous 2 years, an 80 and an 82 in terms of his goaltending ranking, which if you look at this list, would put him right about at 10th in terms of overall goaltending. So he was a top 10 goalie in fantasy. Then he got into some injury trouble. Rumor has it he wasn't healthy at all last year, and then eventually had to take care of that mid-season. The thing that troubles me is that he does have this floor, 42, 48, and then a 47. So there's a wild variance between what he's going to do year to year. But when he's on, he's elite level, top 10. And where he's going right now is potentially something that you want to get access to. I'm just trying to find it here as I'm talking, which is a little bit difficult to do, but I think he's way down here at 95.8. So you're able to get a guy who starts a ton. Now, it doesn't show up in the data last year because he was injured, but he was a guy who was starting 60 games the previous season. So he's a heavy starter. There's not a huge backup pressure coming from his backup potentially threatening him for starts. The wins are going to be question mark because of what's happening on the blue line in Vancouver. The save percentage doesn't look good. It got better over the course of the season when he came back, and it got better under Rick Tocchet. So Rick Tocchet comes in, and their team essentially was on pace for over 100 points when Tocchet was the coach. So they were, I forget what the record was. It was like 24-16-2 or something like that. And they were much better under Tocchet, and they actually brought their goals against per game down under Tocchet. And I mentioned that last year in a fantasy file short when he got hired. That's what happened in Arizona. They brought the goals against down significantly. That made Darcy Kemper a goaltender that you could own in fantasy, and then that vaulted him into the conversation of becoming a trade target, going to Colorado, etc. So Rick Tocchet can have that effect, and if you want to take a shot on him at 98 or wherever he's going in terms of his ADP, 95.8, this is a nice high upside play because of the fact that you're getting a coach who likes to coach defense. They've made a couple of changes. They got OEL out of there. They may not be the best defensive team, but at least they're probably going to be closer to 40, 50 percentile in that regard. 51 right now is not bad. And I would expect this number to come up for Demko, the save percentage to come up. The shutouts should come up as well. So he's a high-risk guy that you could get access to. Now, there's a couple other guys that we could talk about here, even in terms of tandems. Now, this doesn't necessarily show up on the data, because of the fact that Cam Talbot wasn't playing for LA last year, but he is now. And you can see their team defense is elite level. So 89th percentile, 42nd percentile in goals saved above expected. He wasn't on this team last year. So that's going to be one of the factors that's potentially going to improve. Same thing with save percentage, not really ownable at an 898. If he can bring that up at least to league average, he's going at 171. So that's really nice value. If you want to pair him, with Phoenix Copley, you could potentially get a nice tandem really deep in the draft. I don't see Copley on this list, but he did. Here he is, number 15. So Copley was actually really good last year in stretches. Before they brought over Korpisalo, he was carrying the team. He was, I think, 23-3-1 or something to that effect. He was really good in a small sample size for LA. So between the two of them, 175 and then 171. You could get this tandem extremely late in the draft. So that Thompson-Hill tandem or this Copley-Talbot tandem could be really what you're looking for if you're at the front or the tail end of the snake. So just a couple more options for you. I'm not going to go too much into more detail about this. You can find the Goaltending Hub, the Player Hub, a custom weighting dashboard where you can put in your own custom point weighting and get a rankings list from that, and my 23-24 weighted rankings dashboard. All are of these are available in the Patreon link in the description below. For $3 a month, you get access to all of this. For $5 a month, you get access to all of this, plus our elite level fantasy Discord group. But this is an excellent resource for fantasy owners. You get access to all of that for $5. Again, links in the description below. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.